Hello everyone, I'm Sharon Stein and I have the extremely difficult task today of speaking to you about pedagogies for confronting climate colonialism in under 10 minutes. I'll do my best. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what is currently known as British Columbia, Canada. And I want to emphasize my responsibility to support their struggles to have their lands returned to them and their livelihoods restored, which incidentally is extremely related to the climate and nature emergency, so very relevant to the talk today. I also want to acknowledge that although I'm doing this talk alone, I'm also not doing it alone. I bring with me my research collective, Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. It's extremely difficult to do this kind of work by yourself. We need to do this collectively, and we need the insights and the contributions of all people from many different walks of life. So the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective is an interdisciplinary, international, intergenerational collective of researchers, artists, educators, activists, and Indigenous community knowledge holders. And we work together at the interface of questions about systemic colonial violence and ecological unsustainability. So again, precisely the interface of climate colonialism. And we ask questions about how would we educate for interrupting these harmful patterns and imagining otherwise possibilities. And one of the things we emphasize is that this is extremely difficult, complex, and even painful work. There are no easy solutions, there's no checklists, and we're dealing with multiple moving, complex, wicked problems that require us to be attentive to the past, present, and future implications of the world we have inherited and how we're going to confront the challenges that we face. So rather than provide solutions, we want to support people to develop the stamina and the capacities to actually face these wicked problems and do that without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or wanting quick fixes, but actually being able to discern what is relevant and responsible within their own contexts. So that's the invitation for today as well, understanding that this is difficult learning, but it's also extremely necessary if we are to survive the coming challenges that in many ways are already here and are only going to get more intense. So in its latest report, the IPCC actually finally acknowledged what many Indigenous communities and other communities on the front lines of climate change have already recognized for a long time, which is that there is a key role of colonialism in climate change. Now, despite what this headline says, in fact, the IPCC didn't go so far as to say that colonialism caused climate change, but that's precisely what these communities have concluded, that colonialism is not only a key cause, but also an ongoing driver of climate change. And it's interesting that this conversation about colonialism is becoming more and more mainstream. So what is climate colonialism? Again, difficult to summarize in 10 minutes. I will do my best. Just in brief, it is precisely at this interface of the unsustainable nature of our current political economic system and historical systemic ongoing violence that also drive this system as well. And at the place where they meet is where we can find climate colonialism. In many ways, it's also difficult to disentangle the two once you start to see the connections, that the climate and nature emergency is not separate from genocide and dispossession, but rather they are deeply, deeply related, which is again what many Indigenous and other frontline communities have been pointing out for a long time. So I'm going to try and summarize some of the basic insights of people who have been looking at climate colonialism for a long time. The first is that, again, colonialism is a root cause and driver of the climate and nature emergency, which means that it has actually been this emergency has actually been going on for a long time, over 5 centuries, since the onset of European colonization. But it's only now considered an emergency because the people who previously benefited from dominant systems are starting to face the consequences of this emergency. So now it feels like something that we need to pay attention to. The second is that the whiter and wealthier segments of the world are disproportionately responsible for causing the climate and nature emergency, for instance, through our carbon emissions. And then, of course, the related is that the impacts of the climate and nature emergency are disproportionately experienced by marginalized communities who have contributed the least to the climate and nature emergency. Fourth is that many climate action, mitigation, and adaptation efforts are what some people call false solutions that not only tend to reproduce colonial relationships, but don't necessarily even interrupt the climate and nature emergency itself. For instance, things like carbon trading, where countries or companies in the global north pay money to quote unquote protect forests in the global south, when in fact this purchase of these lands as an offset tends to result in the displacement of indigenous communities from their territories and their livelihoods. There's also the fact that many forms of quote unquote clean or green energy actually require the mining of rare earth minerals and vast tracts of land that again result in not only dispossession of indigenous peoples, but also further degradation of land. Sixth is that indigenous peoples and other frontline communities should be the ones guiding efforts to address the climate and nature emergency because they are the most affected by it and because they know their lands better than anybody and how these things have changed over time and how we might responsibly respond. Sixth is that respecting indigenous rights and knowledges is not only important because of environmental benefits, but also because these communities have inherent rights to guard and protect and make decisions about what happens on their lands. Seventh is that the beneficiaries of the modern colonial system that has caused the climate and nature emergency have a debt to indigenous and other frontline communities. So that's climate colonialism in a nutshell. Also summarized really well by indigenous environmental philosopher Kyle White, who says that the harms that many non-indigenous persons dread most of the climate crisis are the ones that indigenous peoples have endured already due to different forms of colonialism: ecosystem collapse, species loss, economic crash, drastic relocation, and cultural disintegration. So, in many ways, mainstream responses to climate change, including mainstream climate education, are grounded in this desire to transcend the climate and nature emergency without actually having to give anything up, without actually having to transform our current system. And this results in the displacement of the costs of continuing business as usual for the global north onto the global south and marginalized communities in the global north, like indigenous communities. So if this is the case, if not only is the climate and nature emergency caused by colonialism, but our responses to the climate and nature emergency are also further exacerbating colonialism, then what is the role of education in reproducing or interrupting climate colonialism? First, let's start with some common assumptions of modern colonial education. And again, these are guiding assumptions that are not necessarily true, but what many people presume to be true. So one is that talking about negative things makes people feel demotivated, so we won't talk about negative things. Two is that complexity and the lack of simple solutions causes people to feel overwhelmed. Three is that exposing people's complicities makes them feel uncomfortable and again, not wanting to engage. Fourth is that uncertainty makes people feel immobilized. And finally, suggesting that big changes are coming can make people feel hopeless or angry. Now, as a result of these assumptions, what we get when we get mainstream climate education is a few things. One is promise of hope in an idealized future that we imagine from where we currently stand, which of course means that we are projecting things into the future, including projecting our current colonial habits of being, maybe without realizing it. The second is encouraging simple feel-good solutions, even when in fact there are none. And the third is celebrating the agency, especially of young people in the global north, saying that they're going to be the ones to solve the climate crisis and be the leaders, and minimizing their complicity in the problem. And it's not to say that young people don't have an important role to play, but rather that when we promise them that things are going to be easy and things should be hopeful and that things can continue as usual, we are promising them and inviting them to invest in an inherently harmful and unsustainable system. So essentially, mainstream climate education bypasses the difficult, complex, and self-implicating work that is required of us in the present so that we might have the possibility of different futures. And it does not prepare young people to inherit a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA world. So when they actually come up against it, they're not going to be prepared. They are going to then actually feel overwhelmed and immobilized. So what's the proposition? I'm going to suggest that there are 7 basics of imagining climate education differently, or climate education otherwise. The first is to support people to develop intellectual, affective, and relational capacities to navigate the multiple moving layers of complexity and uncertainty in responsible and relevant ways, including being able to analyze what's happening in their own specific context. The second is the need to connect the root causes and effects of coloniality and unsustainability, which I've already talked a great deal about. Third is being able to confront our complicity in harm and in unsustainability and start to unlearn the harmful attachments that keep us invested in this harmful and unsustainable system. Fourth is actually centering Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous rights, both because that is their inherent right to govern their territory, but also because they have extremely important insight and knowledges, not only about their specific lands and territories, but also about the fact that it can remind the rest of us that there are very different ways of relating to the earth that are not based on extraction and are not based on unsustainable habits of being. 5 is developing critical literacy about false solutions. So thinking about whenever we see a proposed climate solution, who's deciding on the solution, who's proposing it, in whose name is it given, for whose benefit, and at whose expense might it come. 6th is that if we're going to get out of this alive, we're going to have to learn to weave relationships grounded in trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, and actually weave the future from the work we do in the present, rather than assuming we already know what the future looks like and dragging people with us, weaving the future together through all the complexity and all the tensions and the difficulties that that's going to entail. And finally, activating a sense of intergenerational responsibility, not only for humans, but also for other than human beings as well. And that's an activation that's not just intellectual, but also in the heart and in the guts, not just in the head. So I did not make it to 10 minutes. I did a little bit over, but I'm very grateful for the time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.